Hi, and welcome to It's Time to Thrill. It's me, your host, Amy Austin. It is June, and that means that the school year is coming to an end very soon, and I can begin my summer. I have some fun summer travel planned, and if you follow me on Instagram at Legal Thriller Author, you can keep up with that. I am so delighted to introduce you to author Delilah Marvelle. Delilah, I met her years ago. It's always years ago. And we used to go to these little reader retreats in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. Just up and down the coast. I think we moved it from city to city because there were people, in all of those places. We ironically never had one in LA. San Francisco, believe it or not, was cheaper than LA in that case. So, what was super interesting is she's one of those people I met and instantly became one of my favorite people. So we would go to these conferences that maybe had like 50, 60 people. And then we'd instead of going to group dinners, the two of us would duck out. And I remember the last time we ducked out, we had this great, I think we went to Chinatown in San Francisco and had a great meal. And then there's one place we went in Portland or Seattle that was great as well, that I don't remember because my memory's a little vague. That said, she is one of the most wonderful people I know, and I can't wait to share this conversation with you. The thing that I love about this podcast is that I get an opportunity to have these long form conversations with authors and other creative women who are so smart and so funny and so well read. And I get to share with you a different facet. So, if you buy their paintings or read their books, then you do get one bit of them for yourself. But I really like these conversations because you get to have an opportunity to really see how multifaceted and multidimensional these women are. I don't know why that's important to me, but I love that about them, and I love that about these conversations and this podcast. So you'll get to have this conversation with her. Usually I talk more about writing and books, but it's just, we may have gone off on some tangents, but I think it's such a interesting and wonderful conversation to have because we talk a lot about, I think, some of the things that are behind creativity. And you get to hear about the one book that changed her life. Books change the lives of most of the people I've had on the podcast, but she can point to one book that really made her make a left turn in the kinds of things that she's interested in and the kinds of things that she writes about. And it's so interesting that she had that. So without further ado, let's chat with Delilah Marvelle. I have so many questions. Hi, this is Amy Austin, and welcome to A Time to Thrill. This month, I am so delighted, I can't even tell you, and I'm going to try not to laugh too much, to be, we're laughing already, to bring you an interview with Delilah Marvelle. Hello.
Hi.
I'm so excited to talk to you. You have no idea.
Oh, I am super excited to be part of this, and thank you so much for thinking of me.
You're one of my favorite people. We used to meet up when we used to go to these writers conferences and just sit down and have a meal together. And I missed that.
I
It was
miss
such a
that
great connection.
too. I know, that was amazing. I definitely miss that. I miss seeing your face. It's just gorgeous face.
You too. But then we were locked down in our houses. So I have so locked down. Anyway, so I have about 1,000 questions for you, but I'm going to try to keep it brief. So let me ask you this. What are you working on now? So, okay, so my perception of you is you're the author of, I don't know how you describe them, saucy historical romances. There's so many words. And you used to, well, I don't know if you still do the historical thing. You did so many things that were so supportive of historical romances. It was super interesting. It's not my genre at all. I love contemporary to death, and it's the only thing I've ever written in anything that involves that much work, or wearing a costume is out. But but you and especially your husband always did the whole thing so well. Okay, all that to say, how are you doing and what are you writing these days?
Right now I am trying to finish up the last book in my Whipping Society series. And so it is a three-part series in which it follows the same hero and heroine, which is unusual in historical romances. That a lot of people have a tendency to be one and done. So it follows them through three books. And so it's the last book. And unfortunately, my readers have been waiting for quite some time on this one, and between some personal tragedies and then COVID and everything else, the book just never made it out. And so this is the year. It is definitely, and it's very fitting, it's called Reborn, and so it's
Mm.
very fitting that it come out during a time in which I feel like I'm going through my own rebirth. So I've always loved historical romance. Um, After reading Jane Eyre was kind of the
Mhm.
pivotal moment for me in high school as a freshman, and Jane Eyre was me. And
Wow.
I saw myself, and I thought that that was just so bizarre that a book written, over 100 years ago,
Mhm.
she was going through the same struggles I was. And
Yeah.
that resonated with me, and that's why historical romance in particular really resonates with me, because I feel like like you said, you have a love for contemporary, but in many ways the people of the past were no different than the people of today. Just their environment
Yeah.
changed, but they loved the same, they hated the same, they made love the same. I mean, it just everything was kind of the same, except they had different rules, and
Right.
so you played different games.
No, so I will say this. I've always thought that through fiction we see ourselves. And for me, it's always been a way to discover more about not only the self, but discover more about the world and everything. Because well, maybe maybe it's my life. Even though I grew up like in New York City, my life is limited to only a certain number of people. But I've always been like really voyeuristic and wanted to know what in the heck was going on in other people's lives. But also, you learn a lot about, at least I learn a lot about myself and my place in the world and how I see the world from reading fiction. And it has exposed me to so many ideas I don't think I would have ever thought. Um, but it's interesting that Jane Eyre resonated with you. It was a school assigned book.
It was a school assigned book, and because it's not a book that I would have technically picked up on my own. I was not
Mhm.
drawn to history in that way, and but that was a kind of a turning moment for me. And once I started digging in, um, I became voyeuristic as well. I
Okay, so yeah, I have two questions. Okay, so what did you read before? Because that's like a huge turning point. So what kind of things were you reading before that?
fairy tales.
Oh wow. Okay.
So I did a lot of, but and when I say fairy tales, I mean like Grimm's fairy tale, meaning the darker stories.
Mhm, right.
I also, I mean, I read a lot of traditional stuff, but also books that many people would not be familiar with, because I'm actually Polish, first generation Polish. My English is actually my second language. It's not my first language. And so I was reading books like Krzyżacy, and all these basically Polish sagas. Now, mind you, a lot of them were historical,
Right.
but I didn't. I don't know. I didn't. They were they were more kind of in a fairy tale aspect, and so
Mhm,
yeah. So I had a different upbringing as far as my exposure to books was more. They were Polish, not
right.
necessarily, and many of them didn't have translations.
Right. Oh, this is fascinating. So I went to Poland, and I don't know. I'm going to get off to the side. It was 2019 because that was the last, I think one of the last trips I took before I could travel again.
It's a good
And
trip.
I had Yeah, I'd always wanted to go. It's the bizarrest thing. So, like I spent the summer in Hungary. And so I'd always wanted to go. And I was looking at my son one day and I was like, I've always wanted to go to Poland. And he looks at me, he's like, so why don't we go? And I was like, huh? You know? So, I got on a prop plane because it's a very, very short flight.
Yeah.
And went to Poland. And it's one of the places, I think about it actually often. But it's one of those places that just I find utterly fascinating historically, culturally. Like there's so much about it. So when did your parents come here?
My parents in particular came over. My dad was 16 when he came over,
Mhm.
and my mom, I believe, was just a little bit younger when she came over.
Wow. Mhm.
And then my stepmother as well. She came over. She was older. She was more university age, and escaping communism, basically.
Right.
And she was part of the solidarity movement, which was being targeted by the KGB and so on and so forth. And
Mhm.
so she came as a political asylee, and
Okay.
yeah, that was kind of what I grew up around. Where I was always at the age of 6, I was out in front of the Polish consulate yelling for the Russians to get out. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew the Russians were bad.
No, it's utterly fascinating. Like if you had told me, I was actually thinking about this the other day. I was biking or something, and I was like, if you had told me that I would have spent time like in a place behind the Iron Curtain, I could never have conceived of it. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
and now it is utterly fascinating. So, like, a lot of people left different countries at different times, depending on, like, the Czech Republic had one thing, and Hungary had another thing, and Poland had another thing, but it's the
yes,
same sort of thing. So whether it's
yes,
1956 or 1980, whatever.
yes,
So those those little blips happened all over Eastern Europe or Central Europe or whatever you want to call it. But what? So they spoke Polish. So you spoke Polish at home then?
yes. I didn't speak English until I was about. I basically was tossed into first grade, and I was like, "Whoa!" You know, I back then they didn't have any programs, assimilation programs. I
Right.
literally learned um, by tossing me into a classroom and figuring out as people are gesturing at me. It was very, very traumatic, but at the same time, it made me very resilient. I learned to really pay attention to people's facial features. And so a lot of these things that then translated into me being a writer, I really
Mhm.
paid attention to physical cues, emotional cues in a way that words can't describe.
Convey. Yes, yes. I mean, I know because well, we can we can debate my language skills. So I speak English well, and I speak 2 other languages as well as I can. And, what I've read, and I actually truly believe, is that, like, the language is, like, 70%, like, tone, gesture, like, seeing people actually made it very hard during the pandemic because I was like, "Oh god, now I can't even see your face." Um and so I think that's super interesting because one of the things that I do like every summer is, I spend a lot of time like I understand 80% of the words you said, but the rest of it I'm going to have to pick up from what you're doing or whatever is going
Yes.
on. Because there
Yes.
can't be that huge lag. I mean, people are moving through life; they're not waiting for you to like translate in your head. You know what
Yes.
I mean?
Yes.
So there's that. So you have to do the best you can to get through that period of lag. So how that's so interesting because I do spend a lot of time thinking, watching people, but I did as a child too, watching people because what people say, and I learned this very young, what people say and what people are really thinking or doing were often different. And the biggest question I used to ask my parents when I was little was, how do you know if people are lying? Because I felt like people were, and I lived in New York, so people were not as like surface smiley. It's like it's other places. Like I live in California, people are smiling. I'm like, I don't know what's going on here because nobody ever says no and everybody's ever mean, but things are weird. But I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what people said versus what people meant. And that's like the space that I lived in. I wonder if that has anything to do with writing. I never thought about it until you just talked about it now.
Oh,
That's super
yeah. It's
interesting.
all interconnected with, human nature, and I think that
Mm.
you can't be a writer until you've lived life and understand the world around you. And so I think that that's, it's all about the human story. And so the more you connect and kind of be in tune with, and in answer to your question about, how do you know people are lying? You don't always know, but there are some things like people have a tendency to touch their face. Like if
Right.
you think of the story of Pinocchio, the nose grind, like people touch their noses and their faces when they're lying, or
Yeah.
so the psychiatrists say.
Yeah. Have you ever read? So there's this woman named Vanessa Van Edwards who's written two books. One is called Captivate, and the other is called Cues. But one of the things that she talks about that's super interesting is she like watches videos of people talking and things, and determines like whether they're lying, what they're really thinking based on like facial expressions and gestures separate
Yeah,
apart from what they're saying. It's actually utterly fascinating because I mean we know like I actually was thinking about this recently. Often I know when people are lying or when people are trying to like, I don't want to say this kindly manipulate you or whatever. They like sometimes people smirk, they like look to the side, like they do a couple of things that I've sort of clued in on in life,
yeah,
that you
yeah,
can tell when people are disassociating from the truth, let's say.
yeah.
But it's super interesting in terms of language. So how you're one of two people I know who writes in a second language per se, not like, it's
Yes,
not like you learned it at 20. Do you think does that affect your writing in any way, do you think?
it does. It does. I have a tendency to sometimes flip words.
Mhm.
Meaning like, my adjectives always go before they're supposed to go or below, so
Mhm.
meaning like there are certain, for instance, just as in any other language, there are certain things you say in Polish that you cannot say. It won't translate right in English, but
Right.
I'm thinking that in my head. And so when I write it, I'm like, well, that's not right. Is it? Is it right? Or is it? So I sometimes have a tendency to over edit myself because instead of listening to the gut and just let it flow. And I do have editors who point out, you flipped this, because it,
Right.
it comes across completely different, kind of like, well, did you mean this or did you mean that?
Right.
So sometimes things do get literally lost in translation. But I've learned, the longer you write, the more you understand your weaknesses and your strengths, and I really
Yes.
play to both.
Yeah, no, it's so funny because like at this point I don't actually take it personally at all. Like, but I do hesitate because I know there's like two issues I have. It's like saying like as versus like, and also I love to say she said, comma, and a gerund. I love a good gerund. And she was like, she said running. She said, and like my editor's like, could you let that go? And I'm like, but I love it. So I do overcorrect actually now when I write. Like I'm typing it I was doing yesterday. It's like she said, and I'm like, okay, so how am I going to say the thing I want to say without using this horrible phraseology
Yeah.
every single time? But okay, so I have another question. So Jane Eyre, like that's such a, I don't, now you're making me think, was there a life changing book in my life? I don't know if there was one. Um, but I will say this your historicals are, I don't, a far cry from Jane Eyre in terms of, well, there's also time. So in terms of like sexiness and in terms of, I feel like theme, but maybe I'm not right there. What do you think makes you write the kinds of books that you write and not like, how people write that sort of, I don't want to call it Jane Eyre fan fiction. Like one of my publishers did that for 1 year. They were like, can you modernize whatever the thing was? They wanted people to modernize. It was Jane Eyre and a bunch of like Austen books. I don't know. And I just, I didn't do that. But there are a lot of people who do that. And I would say that you're not at all in that camp.
No, no, but, to say, like Jane Eyre, if we step back to the time it was actually written, it
Right.
was very dark and very sexy and very provocative for its time. I mean, you
Right.
literally had a woman who was displaced, outside of society and literally in a dark place herself, literally, and figuratively,
Right.
and surrounded by a man who, oh, I don't want to ruin everybody, whoever hasn't read Jane Eyre, but by a man who is soulfully and physically attracted to her, but he's, he's spoken for, so to speak, and not
Right.
on his own terms. And so that in and of itself, I mean, for, a married man to be wooing and wanting a unwed virginal girl,
Right.
just in and of itself is like so many taboos, and especially who the wife was hidden away in the attic. That is another form
Right.
of taboo, from a cultural standpoint. So, I mean, there are just so many of these taboos, and very provocative, very deep. And I really ran with it, except I'm like, I'm living in an age where I can say everything.
Right.
And for me, um, you cannot from my through my perspective, you cannot really touch a finger to the real aspect of love and a relationship if you're not talking about sex. And
Mhm.
it really is, that is the one moment in time in which you are exposing, no pun intended, yourself. You're
Right.
bearing everything to the
Mhm.
person you're with. And so to me, it's like, well, why are we not talking about it? I think, sex is such a huge part of the relationship. It leads to
Mhm.
children, leads to happiness or unhappiness if you're not being, so all these things. And so I just see it as extra wallpaper in it, a damask
Right.
wallpaper in the room, so I really do plot out the sex aspect of the relationship, meaning, like, is she a virgin? Is she been married? How does that play into who she is sexually and compared to who he is sexually? Because in the end, sex isn't everything, but it's definitely a part of who you are.
Wait, okay, so I ask you this because I was thinking about this morning, which reveals way too much about how my morning was going. But I was thinking about, well, I was reading and thinking about sex and vulnerability because one of the complaints that a lot of, well, both women and men seem to have is that their partner will be sexual with them, but they don't feel their partner's being truly vulnerable with them, like sexually, not, in other aspects of life, but maybe that crosses over. I'd have to think about that more.
Yeah.
But and I was thinking about it in terms of romance because in romance, at least the ones I've written, no, let me take it back. That is an era people. Okay, my later romances is an era people have showed vulnerability. In my earlier romances, a lot of my heroines were kind of closed off to showing that vulnerability. But how do you navigate that? Because I have found when reading romance, the heroes and heroines tend to be more vulnerable than my personal experience of people in real life. Um, but readers don't seem to like people who are more closed off unless that's part of the growth in the book. But how do you handle the people have vulnerability in sex is hard, especially in the puritanical culture in which I grew up. So how do you handle that vulnerability aspect?
Uh, it's all having to do with character. The character that I choose will end up dictating that vulnerability. Meaning, for some,
Mhm.
it's they're laid out. That's just who they are, and so they will be vulnerable. And then other ones, like you said, it's kind of like a character growth. I definitely find that we're still in this puritanical society. I really do see we are a modern day Victorian era in some ways. We
So
still haven't
much.
we haven't stepped away from it. People like to think that, oh yeah, now that we can talk about sex and we can talk about, you know, um, sexuality and all this stuff, that oh, now we've opened up, and that's just so not true. I mean, people are still
Mhm.
very uncomfortable with taboo. I mean, there are times that even as I'm writing, I have to step back and ask myself, is my reader going to be um, uncomfortable reading this?
Mhm.
Because that's just where the character is going.
Right.
And I have to be true to my art. And that's why I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I got a little brandy in there, so it's which is how Queen Victoria, a lot of people don't know, Queen Victoria, she disliked tea, but she only had her tea if she had a little special something extra in it. So, she liked a little bit of brandy in there, or gin.
Mhm. Um, I will say that that's not a bad thing. I haven't had that
No,
in years. See, now you're making me think about it, but I used to sometimes have, oh, coffee with a little bit of rum is spectacular.
it
But
is.
I haven't done it in years. Now I want to do it, but I don't have any alcohol in my house. Okay. Uh, because I can't consume it fast enough, and it just lingers around, and it's just something else to store.
I'm
Also, I
with you.
went through a little Manhattan period during COVID, and I had to let that go. So it was like, let's make cocktails because I've already made enough cake.
I went through I went through a sake period, so I was consuming a lot of plum sake. So,
Ah, yes, but now for a moment, I miss it for a moment, but it's
yes,
about to rain, so maybe not today.
yeah.
So in terms in terms of so what formed okay, so I don't want to say very specific, right? I don't want to make it like it's some big thing, but how did you come to write the kinds of books that you do? Because most historical writers I know, I don't want to say this. I don't mean this in any way it's going to sound, but start out with like a lovely drawing room, scene, and and the wallpapers, this way, and everybody's got this kind of dress, and he's going to look at her a certain way, and they're. I don't want to say they're chaste because that's not the case with historical. I have found out as an adult, historicals had more sex than contemporary when I was younger. I had no
Yeah.
idea. Um, but what made you turn that on its ear? I guess.
I would probably say something bigger stepped in, like something greater being, if I can say be so bold. So I was writing it took a lot of books before I finally was published. I mean, I had written quite a few. I think I read like I think I ended up writing 25 books before my first book was published. And
Wow.
so I just kept going. I kept,
Hmm.
knocking on that door and just but so and I'm like, well, something must not be right if they are still refusing my books. I'm like, I got, I'm up for the golden heart. So many things were happening for me, but it
Right.
still wasn't clicking. So something was off. And so I decided to kind of dig around in a different form of history. And so I was doing kind of the traditional historical, like you were saying. I was kind of like where it starts maybe with a drawing room or a dark
Right.
alley or just
Right.
something, like, that starts a historical, the
Right.
rustling of a gown, that kind of thing.
Yes, very
And
much.
yeah, and so I had just finished a book, like literally wrote the end. And I'm like, this is the best book I've ever written. And
Mhm.
something happened, and literally the file was corrupted and it got deleted from my thing. Something happened, like the whole thing just blanked. And I freaked out. And it was like, I'm never
I'd
going to
still be
write again.
laying down 20 years later. I don't understand. Okay.
Yeah, no,
I
I'm
want to lay
still
down. I
talking
want
about.
to lay down now. Okay.
Yeah, and it was one of the longest books I'd ever written too, so it
Right.
was kinda like this double whammy, like, "Oh my how could this happen? How what?" And, that was one of those turning points for me, like, a screw it, like, I'm just like, I don't care what I write now, I guess. I don't. And so I just
Mhm.
started writing, and, in particular, I was reading I draw a lot of my stuff from I read a lot of historical nonfiction. That's what
Right.
I have always gravitated to, and documentaries and so on and so forth. And came across a character in history that this my first book series that was published was based on a French courtesan who opened up her drawing room to men to talk about sex, and
Mhm.
I'm like, okay, there's a story there. We got let's get this started. And so I literally that screw it mentality
Mhm.
literally translated to me going down that path, and ultimately when I finished that book and I sent it out, that was the one that got me published. So it was like when I no
Wow.
longer cared what
Mhm.
the world would think, that is when I got published.
Wow. That's yeah, it's one of those, people are always like follow your heart, and you're like, have you read the Harlequin
Yeah.
rules? There are 50 rules and one must follow these 50 rules, but follow your heart. Sure, I'll see how I can do that within these 50 rules.
Yes.
But that's fascinating. What year was your first book published? I don't remember this.
It was 2000. So I sold it in 2006, and it came out in 2008.
Yeah, of course, I remember those days. Okay.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
sold
and that was a
sold the
whole
book.
journey of and of itself, so
Right. Do you and well, let me ask you this because that was before times. What was the reception from readers, if you know? Because the readers didn't have, you had a post office box and people would send you like a postcard, but it
Yeah,
wasn't, they
yeah.
couldn't like just message you on Facebook. So what was the reader reception, do you think, or do you
Oh,
know?
it was phenomenal. It
Mm,
was, overwhelming. Of course, I expected that. I actually expected a very negative, reaction because,
mhm.
um, I literally was talking about, so my book featured a dildo,
Right.
I mean, in a historical term. So I did have one of those readers that were kind of like, they didn't have dildos back then. And I'm like, oh, 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 okay, we need a blog now. We need to educate people on what they did and didn't do in history.
Right.
And so I was getting, and then I was up for an award, RT, Romantic Times. They
Mhm.
snatched me up for best first book, for best first historical romance, and I got a lot of attention. And I don't know if it's because the dildo or not, but it I did get, I got letters, I did get emails. I did get emails.
Okay.
I did get, letters. I got a little bit of everything. I mean, the publisher would forward me letters.
Right.
But yeah, no, it was pretty overwhelming, and I sold out of my first print run in like 6 months or 7 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um, for listeners, that's a very big deal because,
Yeah, yeah.
she's not on the returns bin where they're tearing off the cover and pulping the book. Not that anyone would know anything about that. So
Yeah, I
what,
know.
what, what from there, then did you sell like in a 2 or 3 book deal? I don't
It
know.
was a 2-book deal.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a
And
2-book deal.
so okay, by 2008, had you written the second book then?
No, no, in fact,
Oh,
when I sold the book and it was a 2 big deal, I went through a panic. It's kind of a long story, but I kind of had reached that point when I put out my book, and, meaning when I put it out to the publisher, I had
right.
already been shifting gears. It's kind of a slightly longer story, but I actually went
Mhm.
through some trauma. My husband was almost murdered in front of me and my kids,
Right.
and I had gotten involved and basically, um, took on the assailant, so to speak. There were
Mhm.
2 of them, and, took a lot of blows to the head and so on and so forth. Anyways, my husband had almost died, and,
Right.
the fact that I'm able to even talk about it without sobbing now that's how much time it kind of took. It's been a while. But,
Mhm.
uh, it set me on a different path because I'm like, I was almost widowed with 2 young kids, who had traumatically witnessed this. Where do I want my life to go?
Right.
And my writing, isn't taking me anywhere. And how am I going to
Mhm.
provide for my children? I have an English degree, which means nothing, that kind of thing.
I
And
have one
so
as well.
it means
Gosh.
it means something, but nothing, but everything. I mean, it's one of
Right.
those. But so I decided I am going to follow my heart, and it went back to that. And yes, I was still writing, but I really kind of set it aside, and went to culinary school and followed my passion, in particular historical foods, and so on and so forth. So, in the middle of culinary school, I sold my book. So here I had already paid for my everything, and I'm like, oh damn, they want a second book. Oh no, and I got to do all these courses and classes, and oh my god, what did I do? But
Right.
when you want things bad enough, that they come to you at a time when you don't necessarily want them. And
Right.
so and but so yeah, so I kind of quickly got on board to writing the second book, and wrote the second book, fairly quickly. It took me about 5 months to write it. I was given 8, but I was, stressing to the point where I
Right.
wanted to get it done sooner.
So what okay, I have like 1,000 questions. So what is okay, I'm interested in the historical food because, let me say this. Okay, so when I grew up, food was different than it is now. And everybody in my family cooked. Like that was, they cooked and they talked about what the kinds of foods that they had grown up with. And so one of my grandmothers was born in 1906, and the other one in 1920. So it wasn't modern day anything. So they did spend a lot of time talking about what they grew up with and how they cook now. And people still have percolators. I don't know. I haven't like they never had a microwave or anything like that. But what was it that drew you to like historical foods?
Um, well, one of the trips that I went to in England, this is prior to going down the historical foods path. I had actually um, visited, obviously, a lot of castles and how they cooked and so on and so forth. So I was always drawn to that aspect. I had, and I was struggling. I was struggling with um, I have Crohn's. So I was
Hmm.
struggling with an autoimmune disease. So food kind of became the centralized thing. And I'm, like, in looking through history, I'm like, well, what did people, did they struggle with these autoimmune diseases? Did they not know about them? Like, what was it about the food then that they were eating that has changed from then to now? And that's a whole other gamut in and of
Oh my
itself.
god, because they knew what was in it. Like it's so interesting. So I will say this. I'm going to be honest. I cook all of my meals, and I'm very
I do
particular
too.
about like it's all organic or whatever. So,
Yes.
but the thing is that I was talking to some doctor about something perimenopause. We can discuss that some other time. But they were talking. There's all these things about like eliminating things from your diet or whatever, and I'm like, I know everything that I eat. Like when I say that, I'm being honest. There's no drive through that I'm not telling you about. I'm not like drinking soda on the side.
Right.
But I think it's super important. And I talked to my son about this, about knowing what you're eating. Like I don't know, it's very, very, very important to me. It's not important to everyone, and that's fine. But I think that at least talking to like my grandparents, they always knew what was in food. And I think the shift, especially because they all moved to New York City well before I was born, like in the 20s and 30s or whatever. But the shift of not knowing like ingredients and things like that was huge because there was a big push, at least especially in the US, in other countries at different times. There was a big push for processed food and buying and using them in cooking. And I never grew up like that. And so I was actually shopping with a friend and she was like, do you ever go in the middle of the store? I'm like, what's in there? I'm like, I'm going to get some tomatoes. And I'm going to get things that I know what they are so I can cut them up and make food. Um, but I think there's a huge shift in people knowing what they're eating. And I think, well, I personally don't think it's good, but that's my own personal political opinion about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that it's time that there's a whole thing that food got taken away from us. There's a reason they call it the Food and Drug Administration.
Right.
Food got taken away from us, and a lot of that. And if we go back in history, and if you start kind of really researching it, um,
Hmm.
we prior to 1910, we
Hmm.
did not consume any seed oils. That's just a very good
Right.
example. So meaning like
Right.
Crisco was not introduced, and it was not part. So it was animal fats. It was butter, lard, meaning it was all animal based.
And tallow. I
And
was talking to my son about this last week.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, no, it was all animal based, and um, people were literally less sick. And I think the seed oils, and the best way to kind of approach this, and from a historical point of view too, is we are live in a time in which you can walk into the grocery store and eat a pineapple, which was only reserved for kings and only maybe once a year, if that.
Hmm.
And now we are exposed to so many different foods that, from a historical standpoint, like our bodies are processing foods that maybe it was never exposed to before. So,
No,
and
this is so
and they're
fascinating. I'm sorry.
genetically
Yeah.
changing. They're genetically
Right.
changing things. So if you look at historical recipes, for instance, like to make an apple pie, um,
Hmm.
if they said 5 apples, the apples of today are not the apples of back then. The apples of back
Right.
then were smaller than the palm of your hand. They're not these
Right.
gargantuan. So if you were to redo that recipe, you would mess it up because it's just even the size of the fruit was they were more flavorful. So
Hmm.
I had the experience of basically trying apples that had been around, prior to 1910. And so
Right.
when you have those, they're more flavorful, they're tinier, but they pack more
Right.
punch. And so
Hmm.
you didn't need a lot of it to enjoy it.
Right.
And so I think everything's kind of changed. And with the processing of introducing of Crisco, for instance, and so on and so forth, they had all this leftover stuff like for corn oil and so on. And they're like,
Right.
what do we do with it? How do we make money off of it? They don't know
Right.
the repercussions of what it's going to do to our body or our society. We've gone so dependent. People don't even know how to, process their own food or their chicken or their, meaning from scratch and break things
Right.
down. And there's a price to pay for that. So you're getting more time to do what?
I don't know. Scroll on your phone and watch Netflix. I don't know. That's right.
Exactly.
It's a good. I have so. Oh my god, you have no idea. Like I went to Sprouts 2 days ago, and there were pineapples two for $5, and I was like, "How do I live in a world where there's pineapples two for $5? Like here now at this time of
Yes.
year? Like it blows my mind. Like my son likes berries, and I when I grew up, there were not berries year round, and I'm like, you can buy like berries like in like March. Like it's so mind blowing to me. It's very interesting. And then actually spending a lot of time in Europe, when I'm there, it's completely different. I mean, not the seed
Yes.
oil. We can talk about the introduction of that. And there's like
Yeah. Yeah.
a whole Europe versus Western Europe thing where they process foods for Eastern Europe that have more sugar and more like trans fat type things
Yep.
than they do in Western Europe, even though they're the same products. But that's a whole
Yes.
conversation I had to like
Yes. And
step
that's
away
a
from.
lot of American influence,
Yeah,
a global influence with regards to foods. I mean,
yeah.
McDonald's
But
taking over the world.
oh, but it's so interesting because it's so when I'm in Europe in the summer, like I go to, I mean, I buy, I have to cook food because I have to eat everywhere. But it's sort of like going back in time. To me, it's like going back, oh God, at this point, 40, 50 years ago, where I can shop similar to how my grandparents shopped. It's like, well, I want
Yes.
a chicken. So you buy a chicken and it's a tiny chicken, but it's really flavorful. Or we buy
Yes.
fruit in the summer and the winter because we
Yes.
were there for Christmas in the winter. It's like, would you like some cabbage? Like, what else you got? They're like, we got some cabbage. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, all the other things are not available. You can't have like bananas year round or avocados and all these other things. You can go to specialty shops and get it because there are a lot of expats who need that. But it's super interesting to sort of be able to like scale your life down to the things that are available, which actually makes it a lot easier, to be honest. What are we having for
Yes.
dinner? We're having the cabbage. You saw the cabbage, we're having that now. But the genetic engineering, even one of the things I was reading about recently was the engineering of Brussels sprouts, because I remember as a child they were kind of gross, and I had not realized that they had been engineered to be less bitter, for one, and some other things around it. Like, I mean, we know about the engineering of corn and things like that, but I had not thought about it in terms of cruciferous vegetables. I mean, I know broccoli is not a thing that exists, in nature, but it's just super interesting because there are changes that I'm well aware of. Like we call rapeseed canola. I mean, there's a lot of things I'm
Yeah.
like clearly aware of, but there's other things that have happened that even I'm not aware of.
Yeah, I think in general, especially with the opening of the internet, people have a tendency to think that we understand more when in fact we understand less. A very
Hmm.
good example, so because of my Crohn's, I've had to really kind of really hone down what was causing it and so on and so forth. And people will be shocked to find that I cannot consume vegetables. I have
Hmm.
found that vegetables actually make me sick. And
Hmm.
I'm like, well, but they're healthy. So what the heck is
Right.
going on? What is going on? And I'm like, oh well, maybe if I do organic, that'll help.
Hmm.
Kind of, no, not really. And so if
Hmm.
I start really researching, the seeds are a problem for me, and it makes total sense because in nature does not want you to eat seeds. Right? If you think from
Right.
because it wants to grow, it wants to sprout. So it will have, they call them oxalates. It'll have a defensive
Right.
chemical in it to prevent you from wanting to eat it. And
Yes,
so
as we rinse our quinoa, but I mean, yes,
yes,
I know.
yes. And
Right.
so I'm just learning that certain bodies are more attuned to certain things, and
Mhm.
so I may horrify some people, but I have a tendency to eat a lot more beef. So that's kind of
Mhm.
what I have my dairy, I have my beef, I have my chickens, and then and my fruit, and that is it.
Mhm.
Like I keep it real simple, and my body loves it, and I have no complaints. And so I'm just learning to simplify like you said, it goes back to the simplification, the way they did it back then. Meaning during
Mhm.
when there was winter time, they didn't have, these wonderful gardens and fruit and stuff like that available to them. So what did they have? They
Right.
had, you know, meat and eggs and whatever, the animals could
Stored
produce
in
for them.
a cellar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or whatever they canned, or whatever they
Right.
canned. So
Yeah.
it goes back to that.
And so have you, okay, so I think about this often. I don't do this because I don't know, maybe I don't have the wherewithal. Like I cook as a practical matter. Like gotta eat like breakfast. I'm gonna cook something. But did you were you one of those people who sort of did the thing where you like looked at old recipes and then put them together to sample test those kinds of things?
Oh
Like, so
yeah.
when I mean, I've gone on those tours. I mean, I'm sure you've gone on those tours. I don't go on them anymore because my child likes weapons, but I used to go on kitchen. I used to not be at armories, but so I used to go on like kitchen tours, and they would have all of these things where they would cook the food of the period as it was cooked. So I've done it with like Roman tours and like even between, let's say, like 16 to like 1850, like depending on where I am, like those kinds of tours. The things are different, whether they're standing on an open fire. But have you done those kinds of things as tours or things as experiments on your own?
Oh, I've done both, and then, I've done my own, actually. I was supposed to before COVID hit, I was supposed to open, my tea house in which I was going to, um, take people through history, and, I wanted
Mm-hmm.
people. I absolutely I think that, kind of a way of touching history is by tasting it, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes any sense whatsoever.
Yes.
And, it is, how certain scents and certain flavors and certain aspects and mouthfeels can literally take you back in time. People like literally can experience their childhood that way, and it's kind of like it's a
Absolutely.
it's a big way of connecting to our ancestors, and
Mhm.
so yeah, I actually have a massive collection of historical cookbooks. My oldest one being from 1739, and I love going through them. And one of these days, I plan on doing channel in which I may, walk people through it. I just love it so much. And because
Mhm.
it shows you the simplicity of how they cooked, and yet it was really sophisticated too. I mean, if we move forward through history, for instance, um, the French Revolution changed. It modernized how we have restaurants, for instance, because when they
Yes.
started guillotining all the rich people, then all the chefs were out of work, and
Right.
and they had to find work, and so it kind of shifted them into opening their own restaurants and exposing your everyday average person to the way the rich people ate,
Mhm.
and that kind of has stayed in and escalated where I mean my most favorite experience ever was going to a restaurant that I cringe every time I think about the bill. I cringe, but I would do it again. And it would remind you
Mhm.
once, but I would do it again. And it was Jean Robuchon. And there's only two places you can go to it. It's in Paris, and then there's
Mhm.
one in Vegas.
Right.
And the most exquisite experience I've ever had. And it's one of those things that just it takes you through different types of palettes and so on and so on. So I just yeah, I have to say food from a historical standpoint has changed, and we allowed it to change, unfortunately.
Yeah, I spend, so much time thinking about it. Because one of the things people ask me, like, what I like about Hungary, and I was like, when I was growing up in New York, there's a large Hungarian population then. Now, who knows? But actually, no, not now. But there are all these bakeries, and so when I'm there, like, I can walk into a bakery, and it's like, oh my God, here's my childhood. I can smell it, I can taste it. It's fascinating because I would not be able to do it here, but I
Yes.
can do it there. And at some point, I was saying something, probably serving my child something, And he was like, "This is really good." And he's like, "I think you have worked diligently to make your childhood tastes my childhood tastes." And I was
Aw.
like, "It wasn't deliberate, but I enjoy it so much that that's what I cook. I mean, I cook those kinds of things
Right.
because I can." And he doesn't cook. He's a child, so he gets what he gets.
Yeah.
Um, but it's super fascinating, that ability of food to take you back. Do you write about food a lot in your books? Because I was thinking about this. Okay, so yesterday I wrote a scene. I never write about food in books because there's too much going on. That
Yeah.
it's like people going to the bathroom and taking showers. Like that, they don't do it. But I actually may take it out because I wrote this scene and I was like, this reporter was going into this woman's house and asking her to expose the thing, whatever, it doesn't matter, that part. And the woman was like cooking and she was like sauteing chicken and adding like lemon and butter and not curdling it and something like that. And so they actually stopped to eat and I wrote about it a lot. And I was like, I don't know. I got like, this never happens. I sort of went down a rabbit hole because it seemed like such a warm way for them to connect when they were not, I don't want to say they're adversarial, but they, working together could go badly for both of them. One's a reporter and one's somebody who's a crime victim, and so that I could go however it goes.
Yeah.
But it was interesting for them to sit down and she talked about her making the food and enjoying the food. And previously, when somebody was murdered, she had been making ziti, and it was just super interesting. But I don't write about it generally because I don't, it's sort of like people ask me, I don't write about cooking and I don't write about travel, which is two things I do the most, but it's just not what I think about in terms of telling a story. But do you include food a lot in your books?
Not a lot, and I think, it goes back to, like you were saying, it's almost, if it's reflective of the story, then
Hmm.
yes, and I totally see that, I actually love how you described, it's kind of like where, your characters are connecting over something, mutual and something that you correlate to as well.
Right.
Um, I do use it, for instance, the current book I'm writing, um, not to backlog too much, but the hero had experienced some trauma to where um, he learned to amplify what his experience was. Where I'm trying not to give too much away because my readers aren't going to. I don't want to give away
Yeah,
what they're
right.
going to find out in the book, but it amplified his ability to taste food differently. So I mean, everything kind of became more amplified because of his experience, and
Hmm.
it changed the way he looked at food, it changed the way he looked at the sky, and and that's when, yes, I will discuss food, meaning like, how does this relate to this particular character? So
Hmm.
and one of these days I would love to, have, you know a female character who is actually in the kitchens of, a bigger home. That'd be kind of fun, but
Oh, that would be fun. Okay. No, no,
Downton
I'm with you.
Abbey, Downton Abbey has turned
Yeah.
me on to a lot of that stuff, kind of like, oh, this can be done without it being boring. you know?
This is so funny because I recently rewatched, I don't know, like a couple of episodes. I don't know, I was somewhere. I think I was on a plane, to be frank. And I was like, I got like 10 hours to kill. So I was rewatching episodes and I was watching her like whip something. I am very bad at anything involving eggs and tempering. It's not, I don't have the patience for it. I think I'm just too scatterbrained for it. But I was watching her do something like a curd or something, and I was like, "Oh, that's so fascinating because that's such a delicious and lovely thing to serve that does require that you stand over that copper bowl with that whisk." You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I was like, "Oh, it was super interesting because they spend so much time cooking downstairs and then upstairs, the characters are too busy living their like, dramatic lives to focus on food, even though serving high quality food is very important for many reasons, status. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons. But it's super interesting to me because food is so important in some ways and not important at all in other ways,
Well, we're blessed, this modern day and age, so to speak, that we are surrounded by, we have access to it. Back then, you literally had to dig it out of the ground. And
Right.
so and so and even how that you were saying, kind of like the preparations and understanding how things were prepared. So for instance, prior to the 1860s, there was no leavening.
Hmm.
You didn't have baking powder or baking soda and stuff like that. And so how did
Hmm.
they leaven? That's why they used copper pots and
Right.
copper bowls, because they then, could whisk it in, and the interaction between the eggs and the copper kind of
Hmm.
helped kind of leaven certain things. And so, meaning like
Right.
you start understanding, okay, what don't I have access to? And that's another thing that I'm kind of really um, drawn to, is that resilience, that
Hmm.
resilience that people had then that they do not have now. I will say, like COVID
Hmm.
exposed how unresilient people are. Meaning, like, what do
Right.
you mean I can't get toilet paper? I'm like, figure it out. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't that difficult. Meaning,
Right.
like, use a rag if you have to. Like, that's what they did back then. Like, they figured it
Right.
out. If they did not have access to it, they didn't wait for it to be delivered to them. They figured it out. And that's what I love about history. It's like people in their struggles became more resilient, and they didn't
Mhm.
complain. They fought their battles if they needed to. They did what they needed to do to survive.
This is so interesting because I always say, okay, so one thing I can't tolerate is zombies because there's no good explanation for how they become zombies. Like I have not come across one in any lore, and I find it endlessly frustrating. That said, I always say to my son, I'd be really great in a zombie apocalypse because I was listening to some like, well, it was a podcast, but sort of radio drama like several years ago, and it was in LA, and they had a zombie apocalypse, and we were like, what are we gonna eat? And I was like, oh, honey. It was like, and she was trying to grow like, I don't know, like sprouts or something. And I was like, oh dear, dear. Oh, you're gonna starve to death. I'm gonna be over here like figuring it because they came across chickens and like, what do we do? And I'm like, did your parents not talking about dipping it and you dip it into hot water and the feathers come out and then you cut it? Like, come on,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
and it was just super interesting that the knowledge has gone so quickly and it's something I never there's a human history and there's knowledge that's been carried down, but some of it is being lost at such a rapid rate, despite the fact that we have the internet and more books and more stuff than ever before. And I can't I can't put my finger on how that's going to work out. Um, but I find it interesting that so many things are going so quickly.
Yeah, and there's, that saying, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And a lot of that has to come down to basically people's level of resilience and their understanding of who they are, and not only that, but their knowledge. And that knowledge is being lost. The fact that
Mhm,
people don't want to know, well, why did people eat meat? Like,
mhm,
why? Because that was
mhm.
what was available to them, and that was something that they understood and could harvest at all times of the year. During the
Right.
winter time, you didn't have vegetables and so on and so. We have kind of taken out, our technology has kind of changed how we look at food, and that might not be a good thing.
Right.
And so, yeah, it goes back to that knowledge is being lost. And so
Mhm.
I love it's funny. I'm surrounded, I live on 80 acres of land, and so
Right.
I'm very, it's a lot of work, and but
Mhm.
I love it, so I'm like the lady of the land, so to speak. But it's just so much work, constant work. And I'm surrounded by, I'm the youngest, like, on what I own, and I'm surrounded by people who are, 80 and above, like,
Mhm.
just old school. And I'm constantly like, those are the people that I'm drawn to, and because they have so much to share and teach. And I am like, why wouldn't you want to go show up at somebody's door and they're teaching you how they're harvesting honey, or
Mhm.
to all these things? Is just, there's just so much to learn, and so much. I'm originally from Chicago, yeah,
Mhm.
yes, first generation. I grew up, in the Polish side of town, but in the big city, it was kind of like, you had your hot dogs and your pizza, and that
Right.
was kind of like, and you just went to the store, you got what you needed, and that was it. And out here, it's just a completely different world. I'm in Oregon, and I just definitely feel more. This is how I'm less stressed, I guess is a way of saying.
Mhm.
Well, in a city, I'm more elbow to elbow with people, and I kind of think that that's part of the problem is that everybody's supposed to have their own little piece of heaven, their little piece of
Right.
land that they can cultivate for themselves.
Okay, I have two questions. One, okay, so but when I grew up in New York City, I did not initiate anything. I was a child. I just went along. But I did go to like live markets and things like that, which I don't even know if they exist or if they're illegal now. I don't actually don't even know. But like my grandmothers would pick out like chickens or whatever, and then somebody would go back and kill it. And then they would kill it and pluck it, and then they would send it home with you. But I did go to live markets, and we went to I know they have one in Cleveland, these like markets that are similar to the ones in Europe, but the big, market hall building that's made of brick, and then the individual stalls of vegetables, fermented food, chicken, fish, whatever is the thing. Did you not go to those kinds of things when you were a kid?
Oh, I did. I did. I
Okay.
did. Yeah, yes. Being in the Polish neighborhoods and stuff like that, I mean, we had exposed. In fact, it was a lot of stuff that I didn't like. I think the
Mhm.
best way to kind of describe it, my upbringing was similar to my big fat Greek wedding in the sense that, I didn't want the brown bread. I wanted the white bread, like the other
Right.
girl. You know what I mean? Like I was,
Mhm.
I had śledzie, which is like pickled herring. I'm like, I don't want
Mhm.
pickled herring. Ew. Like all these things, and then now I'm kind of going back to them. I'm like, like a lot of the vinegar stuff is like good for
Mhm.
my system and all the things. So it's kind of weird how all these things that I thought as a kid were just like, this is disgusting, and now it's like, oh, this is actually pretty dang good. Like my body likes it, so yeah, no, I grew up with a lot of it, but I wasn't. I think part of there's good and bad in being, first generation in the sense that I
Mhm.
belonged to two worlds.
Right.
I belonged to my Polish cultural roots, but then I wanted to belong to, all my friends, their circle, and
Mhm.
so I was torn between two worlds, and their world was pizza and hot dogs, and then mine were pickled herring. So it's kind of like, um,
Oh, that's so interesting. Because
yeah,
it was the same in New York. I mean, pizza is very big. I mean, get a
yes,
slice is go get a slice.
yeah.
And hot dogs, they sold them on the street. I mean, so I get it, but I wonder. I didn't have. So I mean, I've had obviously a lot of pizza, and I don't really like hot dogs. So I've had fewer of those. But I used to have them at the beach on Coney Island and stuff like that when I was a kid. But I didn't feel the dichotomy. So look, I mean, my lunch at school was like, cheese between white bread. Like, but at home, I was comfortable. I ate whatever. I didn't, whatever they made. I think in public, it was different. I'd have to think about that some more. Okay, so the second question is, when did you move? Because I remember before you moved, but in my head, that's like 2000. Oh my God. When did you move? I'm like, sorry, because I'm gonna have to go back in
Yeah,
history and have
no,
to think about it.
I
I
basically.
feel like it's 7 years ago, but maybe there's probably 2 years
No,
I'm
you're
missing.
you're actually no, you're spot on of almost 8 years, and
Okay.
so, in 2014, I moved, and I moved from suburbia. I just kept moving further and further away from the cities. I just
Yeah.
learned, kinda like, and rightfully so. I think the city, there's good and bad in the city. I mean, I grew up in a very rough part of town,
Mhm.
in my Polish neighborhood. I mean, we had the Latin King gangs and so on and so forth. So you had to figure out, okay, you don't go down this alley, you don't go down that alley, meaning
Mhm.
you had to be pretty. And I saw my first dead body when I was 10. I mean, like it's just,
Oh my God, I think I was about the same age. Okay, we're not gonna have that
yeah,
conversation. Anyway,
yeah, no,
somebody
and
got murdered outside of a corner store in Brooklyn. I remember it was so much blood. It was just anyway,
yes.
sorry.
Yeah, mine was a Cadillac with a white interior, and it will never leave my mind because it was the removable tops, and it was down,
Mhm. I
and
remember that.
his body was in there and just blood everywhere, and on this beautiful white, and then this just devastating, like it just like it was surreal. Um,
Mhm.
Something that will always stay with me. But as I said, you just start moving further and further. I'm like, well, out here, yes, I got cougars and bears to worry about, but I know how that they'll play a certain game. You know what I mean? They play by a
Right.
certain nature plays by a certain rule, while humans are kind of a little less predictable.
So much so. It's the thing. I was thinking about yesterday, I was thinking about like animals that kill humans, like, and there's very few like who hunt humans, not like people who run into sharks. That's, you're on your own there. But like it's like lions, polar bears, and other humans. It's like a pretty short list. But the
Cougars.
other human part is, yeah, them too. Let's say big cats. But the other
Yeah.
human part is so unpredictable. It's the one thing I think that I like the least about humans is the unpredictability. Like I every time, so I was in Hungary when the war broke out in Ukraine, and I was like, I can't believe we're having a war. And like my son looks at me, he goes, "Why are you always so surprised?" And I was like, because we have like we're people and we've like learned, and what is progress for if not for peace? And he looks at me and he goes, "I think war is the default." And I was like, okay. And I'm really like I'm still
He's
struggling with that.
he's not wrong in that. I mean,
I know, but I don't like that.
he's from a historical standpoint, but I mean, history does repeat itself. What happened after the
Yeah,
1918 pandemic? We went into the
I know.
Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, followed by World War II. We are on that same
Right.
path, and I
I
think that's
know, and I
kind of scares
see
people.
it.
Except it's more sped
Yeah,
up.
and it's driving me nuts. I'm like looking
Yeah,
at, like, so why is the president of China, like, why is he in like Russia? And oh, is the woman from Taiwan gonna fly here? Whatever. I'm not gonna get into it. Like I'm
yeah,
like
yeah. No,
I'm looking at all the players, and I'm like, oh, there's some like
and if you understand
upheaval in
history,
France and upheaval in Israel. I'm like, oh, this it feels
yeah, no,
heavy.
if you understand history, you will understand the future, and I think that that's kind of the greatest and that's probably why I'm drawn to it. I'm yeah, a little bit sadistic in that sense, like just uh, I understand the direction things are going, and I pay attention to them, and yeah, I think
Does that feel heavy though? Because I
it
feel
is.
like, so I write books and I always try to let me not say, I write about depressing topics. I mean, I'm writing now about like a psychopath. So it's not like it's upbeat flowers and cupcake factories in my book. But I, but I I always feel optimistic and hopeful. I'm like, but if we're smart enough to figure out how to like do things, I know a lot of the things advancements we have are due to war, which I have a lot of feelings about. But if we're smart enough to do all these, look, we can fly planes and we can like move goods and we can like do all of these things. And at the end of the day, I'm like, oh my God, are they rolling tanks again? Like, oh, come on. It's a lot. And I feel like I try to be optimistic in my books to the
Yeah.
extent that people figure out who the bad people are and how to, I don't want to say eradicate them because they're always going to be there, but how to expose them. I'm always into exposing bad people or bad
Yes.
practices or injustice or whatever.
Yes.
So I feel that it's optimistic. I feel if I wrote historical, it's just doom. It's like watching Downton Abbey and you're like, there's a war coming, right? There's a war coming. Like, sitting there, I'm like, you all seem very happy, but I know how this is going to go.
Well, and
It's,
and it goes back to, yeah, no, I completely get what you're saying, and I think that in understanding from that perspective, it's kind of like, but yeah, but if they knew we were going to get to where we're at today, like women of back then, or
Mhm.
a whole number of gamut of people and their struggles, we've come a long way, baby. Kind of like
Right.
it gives me that hope as I write even about history. And and it's a lot of personal experiences too. I mean, not to get overly personal here, but I come from a background in which I was emotionally and physically abused,
Mhm.
and that lends to a lot of how I look at humans, and want to, like you said, it's, you want to expose the bad, but some are redeemable and some are not. some will
Yes.
never be. And so
Yes.
it's kind of like, but the hope is that there could be some that are redeemable, and there's always that hope that, and then in the meantime, what am I doing with my resilience, and how am I protecting those that need to be protected? So it's
Mhm.
kind of that theme of, yes, things can get really dark, but I've always been a hopeful and positive person. It doesn't matter how bad things got. I've always look. I see a blue sky. I really do, and I feel blessed to see that blue sky, because I've seen the dark nights. You know what I mean? So when you see that blue
Mhm.
sky, you're like, that's all I want to see.
So can I ask you this? Because this is something I think about quite often because it sounds like we have a similar background, which is maybe why we get along. But
Yeah.
so I'll be honest, my therapist is always like, you're very resilient. She was like, a lot of other people who grew up like you end up, dead because whether it's suicide, drug addiction,
Hmm.
whatever, like,
Hmm.
it can go a number of ways. None of which, support life. But I wonder do you think what is the resilience? Do you know what makes you resilient where other people aren't? I'm not saying that you're responsible for the other people's like lack of
Yeah.
resilience, but do you know what it is? Because it's one of the things I think about quite often. I was listening to a podcast this morning because I'm the upbeat person about a woman who was with a pathological liar. And she like really bounced back, but one of his other exes really didn't. And I wonder what makes some people more resilient in the face of something that was pretty horrible that happened and other people not.
I think it's character. It has a lot to do with it, and kind of, where you can kind of dig into yourself. I mean, think about it. If you're depending on yourself and you don't have
Mhm,
yourself to depend on, it's very hard to get past that. Like, if you
mhm,
have nothing to dig into, if you have nothing to dig out of yourself,
mhm.
then there is nothing to dig out. So meaning, like, you can't keep digging into a pit and thinking that you're going to be able to crawl out if you're keep still digging yourself into a pit. You know what I mean?
Right. Mhm,
So for me, I knew, even with my experiences with, within my family and stuff, like for instance, my grandfather was an alcoholic. Um, I knew that addiction was high in my family.
mhm,
And seeing that, I was always scared. I told myself, yeah, I don't know why I was smart. Maybe all the books I read and so on and so forth. I was reading books that I maybe shouldn't have been reading at a young age too.
I think we
Um,
all were.
yeah. But I always asked myself the question, if I tried this drug, what if I liked it?
Mhm,
And that was a scary question for me, being kind of like, if he acts like this on that,
mhm,
what am I going to act like on this, on that? So it was kind of like a comparison. It was always a comparison for me. And so writing was my free therapy. I did a lot of
right.
writing in high school. That was where
Mhm.
I discovered myself, and my I rescued myself through writing. And so my writing is very personal to me. Yes, I put it
Oh my
out in the
god, I
world.
think we're like the same person, you're
Yes.
scaring me. Because my grandfather drank so much and then he would whatever. So, it
Yes.
was just that I remember, like, in high school, like, I had friends who were really trying drugs. So, it was like the '80s, they were trying coke and, well, it was really just coke because it was the '80s. And I was like, "I'm not gonna do that," and I didn't drink, and, like, I often didn't go out with people because I knew where that was I knew where it was going. And I was like, I don't see how this is gonna turn out well because and I was talking to somebody recently, I was at a retreat. I think I was talking to another author, and we were talking about drinking. And I was like, "Oh, I've never been drunk." And she's like, "You haven't?" And I was like, "I've seen drunk, and I don't think
Yeah.
I want to be there. And I don't think the loss of control is something I'm willing to give up for the theoretical experience of it."
I think, and you've hit that. And so for me, it was about loss of control. I felt like if I were in the present and I am in my mind and I am fully capable, I can fight for myself.
Mhm. Right.
When I am under any kind of substance or something, I mean, I've gotten drunk, and
Mhm.
at my wedding,
You were allowed.
I was a
I
son.
tried for a dry wedding. It was so controversial. Let's
No,
admit it.
I was a young bride. I was 19 when I got married. Best thing I ever did. But somebody, like literally, I kid you not. So after the wedding, we had a yacht wedding and on Lake Michigan, and it was Memorial Weekend, so we even had fireworks and all this other stuff. And we paid for our own wedding. My husband and I, we literally saved all our pennies, and we paid for our own wedding. And but we all the bars, because I looked like a bride, they're like, she has to be old enough to drink.
Oh my gosh.
And so everybody was like, it's on the house. And, I was celebrating and all that other stuff. So, I joke with my husband, I'm like, I don't remember my wedding night. And he's like, well, I do. And, I do. I was just always messing with him. But, yeah, no, I think that it came down to wanting to always, I like being in control.
Mhm.
And because I never liked when others were in control, like from what the things that were happening, meaning like,
Mhm.
when you're abused, it's a loss of control. You're no longer in control. And so substance abuse is a further kind of like you're letting something else take control because
Mhm.
you're used to other things taking control. And so is me taking that control back and saying, no, I don't want anything to take control of me. And I'm going to control this through writing, and I'm going to try to make some money off of it.
Oh, somebody called it monetized suffering the other day, and I thought, maybe that's what I'm doing. Does writing give you? What does it give you? Like, does it give you? Well, it does give you control because you can control all the people in it. But what does it? How does it nourish you? How does it give you what you need?
I get to spend a lot of time with myself. It's like working on yourself. It really is free therapy. And understanding, I'm like, okay, well, where did this come from? Oh, I went dark real quick. Like, just, meaning like understanding
Right.
the fluctuations of even how I think. I'm like, oh, I really didn't. I'm like, oh, would I let my character do this? Like, does that reflect on me? So it's a lot of banter. So there's, I don't like to plot, meaning I do research for the actual like historical aspects and stuff that I weave in, but I don't like to plot. And a part of that is if I'm not surprised, my readers won't be. And so
Mhm.
I love uh, that element of surprise where I am experiencing it in the same way my reader would, kind of like, where is this coming from? And so it's spending a lot of time with myself, and I really, yeah, I would say yes, playing God, it does have its, perks, but, in the end, I spend a lot of time with myself, and so that's why I'm comfortable with myself is, I'm able to be at peace with myself because I've spent a lot of time in my head and continue to do so.
So how does that so when you said you were gonna move, I remember this and I was like, wow, okay. Because you were describing the acreage and I was like, okay, that's a lot around you. How has being, well, COVID notwithstanding, in a more solitary environment affected you and your writing?
Um, Nature has a very pacifying way of, there's a reason Thoreau went out into the forest. For an artist, I
Mhm.
think nature is its own. It's never the same. Nature is never the same, from
Mhm.
wind picking up to scents to animals to birds. I mean, I have hummingbirds that visit me every day, just all these amazing things happening around. Nature is always moving. And so even though, yes, there's this silence in some ways, there really isn't. It's constantly moving, and it's kind of like my brain. My brain is constantly moving, and sometimes I'll be inside and sometimes I'll step outside, to do my writing. If I'm researching, I like to actually be outside, because that
Mhm.
I don't have to focus as much. So yeah, I kind of think it's given me more peace and more ways to focus that I normally, when and it's hard to write from a historical perspective, when you're in the middle of a city and a Mercedes are revving by and stuff like that. It's kind of like it just doesn't lend to that environment. While here, if you see any of the Jane Austen movies and stuff, I mean, the heroine is walking through the forest and the field and reading. And that is exactly what I am doing. I am connecting with the way they did back then.
That's fascinating. So are you happy that you made the move?
Oh gosh, yeah. There's no going back for me. There's no going back
Yeah.
for me at all. I love
'Cause
my
when you were moving, it
base.
was a little bit unknown. It was a little bit, you're like, "I'm moving to India." I was like, "Okay," I'm not against it. It's just like,
Yeah.
it was a
No,
huge shift. I mean, it's like Chicago, and then you're like, in the Pacific Northwest, and then now you're like out among the trees in the Pacific Northwest, which is a different experience.
it really is, but I think that I the way to look at it is it's twofold. I think that um, I can always find noise when I want to find it. It's finding peace that's very difficult, and I kind of resolve myself that I actually want to live in peace, literally. And
Mhm.
I love the fact that I can literally walk out onto my deck naked and there isn't any neighbor gawking at me if I want to. If I, if I
I'm sorry, I had
want.
this neighbor. That's what they're
So that's what I love about it is I feel like I'm more in control, even more so. Like I control my environment in some ways that I can't control in a city.
Mhm. That's that is super interesting. Okay, you're making me think more about it because I'm such a city person that yeah, okay, I'm such a city person.
I yeah,
I
no,
was thinking about it a lot.
I think
Um,
there's good and bad in it. Like I think from a
mm,
writer perspective, being in a city lends to it. It just reminds me of Charles Dickens, for instance. He walked
right.
every single day. He walked 10 to 15 miles a day. And what
Mhm,
he did was observe people in those 10 to 15 miles that he walked. And that's where he got
mhm,
a lot of his stories, was walking amongst the people,
mhm.
and kind of seeing characters on the street. I mean, all you have to do is go on the street and you got yourself a character.
Oh
Um,
my god, so many.
but I think too, we're going into different times. I think we're kind of Einstein kind of once said like almost like we're going to reverse, kind of like we'll time travel back. And I think when he was kind of referring to that, there's this whole, it isn't that we're going to go back in time. It's almost that
Mhm,
our lives are going to keep getting simplified, because when things
right.
become so complex, they start breaking down.
Mhm.
And as is obvious, COVID broke that narrative, meaning like we
Oh
are
my god,
so,
yes.
the systems got so complex. It's like, when did it become okay that we do not produce anything here in the United States anymore?
Oh my god, I think about this all the time, because I grew up when factories were closing, but, they made shoes in New England, and they made, meat whatever, all the different things and textiles in different places. And I was thinking about the disruption, and I was like, "I don't understand." And I think my child looked at me and goes, "So there was a time when everything wasn't made in China." And I was like, "I remember the shift. I remember it was so there
Yeah.
was like the late '80s and all the free trade and all that." So I mean, I saw it coming. I never quite see it as it turns out because I
And
don't have I'm
I
not
think
prescient that way.
that goes back to that resilience, and it's kind of like, basically, that I was a survivor. That's why I kind of relate to it from a historical, but thinking too, in the Great Depression, people back then were able to take that depression. Today,
Mhm,
they're going to have a really rough time because we are spoiled. And
mhm,
unfortunately, so for instance, back then, a lot of bartering. If you think of bartering, I think is going to make a big comeback. And because people just don't, with the, I mean, I've watched eggs, like, so it's like the 60 egg count at, like for
mhm,
instance, for Walmart. I watched that go within the past year and a half, go from $5.29 to $13. And if
mhm.
people
I
put
just
that
bought
in
$10 eggs
perspective,
the other day.
yeah,
Ugh.
yeah, if you put that in perspective, not everybody can keep up with that kind of inflation. So back then, during the Great Depression, somebody knew how to, okay, you know what? If you give me your eggs from your chickens, I can fix your shoes.
Right.
If you give me this, I can do that. I think those skills, because people have literally, their skills is on the phone. I think people have to relearn skills. And I think if there's any, because people are like, oh, well, how do I prepare for thing when things get tough and stuff? I'm like, learn a skill.
Hmm.
YouTube has, out of the technology that's come, we can expose ourselves to skills that we normally would not have been able to acquire,
Hmm.
unless you went through an apprenticeship back in the day.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think those are the things that people have to start thinking about is, how do we, how do we learn from history?
It's so interesting because I was thinking about this recently because I was wondering how people were absorbing the prices, and I didn't realize that credit card debt had increased proportionally to inflation. And
Oh
I was
yeah.
like, oh, because I couldn't figure out, because every time I go to the store, I'm like, what? Like, I'm confused. I mean, I understand inflation, but it's just like, this is amazing, but I don't understand how people are absorbing it because salaries and have not kept up with inflation. But I didn't realize it was the credit cards, and that's not a can go on forever type thing, but we'll see. So let me ask you this, and I think, let me say this. What, given what you write, your background and everything, is there some story when you think of your entire catalog of books, is there some story that you're trying to tell or some theme that comes through all of your books?
Yeah, I would definitely say redemption,
Mm,
is kind of like an overall, no matter how dark things get, that you can redeem yourself and your view of the world. And, love really does conquer all. And I think that people do not give it enough credit. When I think of romances in general, they're just not given enough credit. I mean, we glorify, all of these, the violent movies and the,
mhm.
horror movies and so on and so forth.
Right,
And
right.
what do you walk away from that? I mean,
Mhm,
aside from being scared and like, oh, we survived, what do you carry with that? And so for me, it's kind of like, the message of love is such a huge one, and it redeems people. It really does, and I am a firm believer in that message. And my husband is a very big reason for the themes in my books. I mean, he really is my hero, and I would not be half the person I am if not for my husband. He he um he quote unquote rescued me from my situation, but I
mhm.
wasn't looking to be rescued. That's the thing.
Right,
It was kind of like I was like my own little spunky heroine, is like, I don't need a man to rescue me. Um
right.
and I didn't want that, but he was like, hey, hey, I'm not looking to take over. I want to just I want to be shoulder to shoulder with you. And that was such a amazing experience to have, and why I was like, okay, we need to get married like now. I knew that this was the person that, I want to grow up with. And that's
Mhm,
why, because it's, people always, diss the age that like, oh, you're too young to get married. No, it's not
mhm,
about how young or how old you are. It's whether you're ready to embrace that you're going to grow up with this person. You're going to grow up, and your relationship's going to evolve, no matter whether you do it at 19 or you do it at 40. It will always be
mhm.
evolving.
Right.
So, yeah, no, I believe in the power of love.
And with that, I will end my lovely conversation with Delilah Marvelle. Thank you so, so, so much for speaking with me today. I love talking to you, and I actually wrote notes for myself because now there's like four more things I have to think about in terms of life, love, and historical food. So it was great having you, Delilah.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
Thank you so much. This has been A Time to Thrill with me, your host, Amy Austin. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope you'll share, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It will help others to find and enjoy my conversations with brilliant women creators. Also, please hit the subscribe button on your podcast app. In addition to hosting this podcast, I am also the author of the Nicole Long series of legal thrillers. The first 3 books in the Nicole Long series are now live. You can download Outcry Witness, Major Crimes, and Without Consent to your e-reader right now. The 4th book in the new series, The Murders Began, is available for pre-order wherever you get your books. I am also the author of the Casey Quit series of legal thrillers. These titles are available wherever books are sold, your local library, and also an audiobook. You can also find this podcast on Facebook at A Time to Thrill. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with you soon with more great conversations.